A week ago, my life detonated like a poorly made bomb, messy, loud, and leaving nothing but wreckage behind. It all began with a knock on my door. I opened it, expecting maybe a delivery or an overegger salesperson. Instead, there she stood. A woman with sharp eyes, a composed expression, and a presence that felt like a courtroom summons in human form. "Hi," she said, her tone calm yet unnervingly firm. "I think we need to talk." "About Daniel." I blinked. "Daniel? Who?" And then it clicked. My Daniel. Oh, my boyfriend of 6 months. But her next words obliterated whatever doubts I had. "I'm his wife." For a moment, I was sure I'd heard wrong. The world tilted, and I swayed, gripping the doorframe to stay upright. Wife Daniel didn't have a wife. He couldn't. I'd been to his place, a cramped bachelor-style apartment littered with takeout containers and laundry. I'd met his friends. I'd left my sweater in his car once and found it exactly where I left it a week later. He was single. He was mine. The woman whose name I later learned was also Saru. A cruel cosmic joke didn't wait for me to recover. She stepped inside like she owned the place, taking stock of my modest apartment with the quiet confidence of someone used to handling messes. "I know this is a lot," she said, her voice disturbingly kind. "Believe me, it was for me, too. When I found out about you, about me," stammered, still rooted to the spot. I didn't know her lips curved into a wry smile. "Of course you didn't. He's good at that. Hiding things, compartmentalizing. It's almost impressive, really." Her sarcasm was sharper than broken glass, and it cut through my fog of disbelief. "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. "This can't be true. I've been to his house. I've met his friends." "His single friends," she corrected, raising an eyebrow. "The ones I don't know. He keeps them separate, just like he keeps me out of his car. We've been married for 4 years. We live in a different apartment. His bachelor pad is as cover convenient for someone like him, don't you think?" The pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place, forming an ugly, nauseating picture. I remembered how he'd always been working late, or traveling for business. How he'd never let me surprise him at work or meet his family. And the money, oh, the money. I'd noticed he wasn't exactly rolling in it, despite claiming he was working harder than ever. "Why are you here?" I finally asked, my voice trembling. "If you know about me, why come to me?" Sarah tilted her head, studying me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. "Because you're not the first, and I'm tired. I'm tired of him lying, of pretending we have a real marriage, of cleaning up his messes. I thought you deserved to know." I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I stumbled back, collapsing onto the couch. This doesn't make sense," I whispered. "He said he loved me." Her expression softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of sadness. In her eyes, he probably does, in his own way. But love doesn't excuse what he's done. To either of us, I didn't remember much of what happened after that. Sarah left soon after, leaving me with a swirling storm of emotions and too many unanswered questions. I couldn't sleep that night, replaying our conversation over and over in my head. How could I have been so blind? How could Daniel, my Daniel, be someone so deceitful? The next day, I confronted him. I waited until his lunch break, marching straight into his office like a woman on a warpath. He looked up from his desk, startled, and his face paled when he saw me. "Sarah," he said, forcing a smile. "What are you doing here?" "Not Sarah. You're Sarah," I spat, slamming my hands on his desk. "Not your wife." His smile faltered, and I saw the panic in his eyes. "Listen, I can explain." "Explain." "What?" I snapped. "Explain how you've been lying to me for 6 months. How you have a whole wife while telling me I'm the only one. Explain why I've wasted half a year on a liar." His office wasn't private. His colleagues were already peeking around the corners, murmuring to each other. I didn't care. I wanted him to feel as exposed as I did. "You disgust me," I hissed, my voice shaking with rage. "You're a coward, a liar, and you don't deserve either of us." He didn't say a word, just sat there, frozen, as I stormed out. For the first time in months, I felt in control. like I was reclaiming a piece of myself that I didn't even realize I'd lost. But the satisfaction didn't last. By the time I got home, the anger had dissolved into a deep, aching sadness. This had been my first relationship in years, my first real attempt at opening up after so many heartbreaks. I'd let myself believe in something real, something lasting. And now, I was left with nothing but betrayal and bitterness. In the aftermath of my confrontation with Daniel, I spent days oscillating between anger and sorrow. I avoided his calls and ignored the few texts he dared to send. The messages were weak attempts at justification, filled with phrases like "it's complicated and you don't understand." Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach turned, but I refused to engage. I thought cutting him off would bring closure, but instead it left me hollow and restless. And then, just as I started to settle into my misery, the doorbell rang again. I froze, gripping the edge of my coffee table. My first thought was that Sarah had come back, but when I opened the door, it wasn't her. It was a man. Tall, sharply dressed, with dark, calculating eyes and a perfectly trimmed beard. He stood there like he owned the world door, at least my tiny apartment building. His gaze swept over me with a mixture of curiosity and disinterest. Like I was just another piece in a puzzle he was trying to solve. "You must be Sarah," he said, his voice smooth and laced with an edge I couldn't quite place. I bristled. "And you are?" "Matthew," he replied, stepping forward without waiting for an invitation. "I believe we have something in common." Daniel, hearing his name again, was like a slap to the face. I stepped back, letting Matthew into my apartment, more out of shock than willingness. He walked in like he'd been here before, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the space. "What do you want?" I asked, crossing my arms. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I came to warn you." "Warn me?" I repeated, narrowing my eyes. "About what?" "About Daniel," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "He's not just a liar. He's dangerous." I laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. "Trust me, I've figured that out. But I'm done with him. He's out of my life." Matthew's gaze sharpened. "Are you sure about that?" I hesitated, his question slicing through my fragile confidence. Was I sure? I wanted to be. But something about the way he asked made my stomach churn. "What are you talking about?" He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Daniel has a habit of collecting people, women mostly. He charms them, uses them, and then discards them when they're no longer useful. Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's connections. Sometimes," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Sometimes what?" I pressed, my voice shaking. "Sometimes it's revenge," he said finally, his voice low. "He's not just a cheater, Sarah. He's a manipulator. And if you're not careful, he'll drag you into his mess, just like he's done with so many others." My blood ran cold. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're not the first," Matthew said simply. "And you won't be the last. But you might be the only one who can stop him." The rest of the conversation was a blur. Matthew told me enough to make my head spin stories of other women Daniel had lied to, relationships he'd sabotaged, and schemes he'd orchestrated. He painted a picture of a man I barely recognized, a master manipulator hiding behind a charming smile and a disarming laugh. But what shook me the most was Matthew's connection to all of this. He wasn't just some good Samaritan trying to help. He was Daniel's former best friend, a man who had been burned by Daniel in ways I could barely comprehend. "He ruined my life," Matthew said, his voice tight with anger. "And I'm not going to let him do it to anyone else." I wanted to believe him, but something about his intensity made me uneasy. Was he really here to help me, or did he have his own agenda? That night, I couldn't sleep. Matthew's words replayed in my mind, intertwining with memories of Daniel, the way he'd looked at me, held me, made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. Had it all been a lie? And if so, why? The next morning, I woke up to a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. It's important." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The message was unsigned, but I knew who it was from. Matthew. Against my better judgment, I replied, "Why?" His response came almost immediately. Because he's not done with you. Matthew's cryptic text stayed with me, gnawing at my thoughts like a splinter buried too deep to pull out. Because he's not done with you? What did that even mean? Was Daniel planning something? And why was Matthew so invested in warning me? The questions buzzed in my head as I stared at my phone, debating whether to meet him again. Against my better judgment, I texted him back where. His reply was instant. Corner Cafe on 5th. Noon. Don't bring anyone. I didn't know who he thought I'd bring. I wasn't exactly in the habit of rallying a posse, but his tone made me uneasy. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging curiosity, the need for answers. So, at noon sharp, I found myself sitting in a booth at the cafe, nursing a coffee I didn't want and waiting for a man I didn't trust. Matthew arrived 10 minutes later, dressed impeccably, as always. He slid into the seat across from me, his gaze scanning the room before settling on me. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice low. "I'm not here because I trust you," I said, crossing my arms. "I just want to know what's going on." He nodded, leaning forward. "Fair enough. Let's start with this. Have you noticed anything strange since you confronted Daniel? Messages, calls, people watching you?" "No," I said, frowning. "Should I have?" Matthew hesitated, his expression darkening. "Daniel doesn't take rejection well, especially not public rejection. You embarrassed him at his office. Didn't you?" "Yeah," I admitted, a flicker of satisfaction warming my chest. But he deserved it. "That might be true," Matthew said, "but Daniel doesn't see it that way. To him, you're a loose end. And if there's one thing Daniel hates, it's loose ends." My stomach tightened. "What are you saying?" "That he's going to come after me, not directly," Matthew said, his tone grave. "That's not his style. He's more subtle than that. He'll twist the knife without you even realizing he's holding it." I shook my head, struggling to process his words. Why would he go to all that trouble? I'm done with him. He's already got a wife, for God's sake. Shouldn't he be focusing on his own mess? Matthew's lips curved into a humorless smile. "You don't get it, do you? It's not about you. It's about control. Daniel doesn't care about people, he cares about power. The moment you humiliated him, you became a threat to that power. And Daniel? He doesn't let threats go unanswered." The rest of the conversation was a blur. Matthew told me things. I could barely comprehend stories of people Daniel had manipulated, careers he'd destroyed, even hints of criminal behavior. The more he talked, more I realized I hadn't just been dating a liaride, been dating a predator. But there was something else nagging at me, something I couldn't ignore. "Why are you telling me all this?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "You said Daniel ruined your life. What happened between you two?" For the first time, Matthew looked uncomfortable. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "That's complicated." "I've got time," I said, crossing my arms. He sighed, his gaze dropping to the table. "Daniel and I used to be close. We started a business together, Multime Consulting. Nothing flashy. It was doing well too, until he started siphoning money out of the accounts. I didn't realize it at first, but by the time I caught on, he'd drained us dry. Then, to top it off, he spread rumors that I was the one stealing. My reputation was destroyed. My clients left. I lost everything." His voice tightened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of vulnerability behind his polished exterior. I tried to fight back, but Daniel's good at covering his tracks. He made me look like a fool, and by the time I could prove anything, it was too late. I stared at him, my mind reeling. "And you think he's going to do the same to me?" "Not the same," Matthew said. "Worse. He's had years to perfect his methods." After our meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I left the house, every time I glanced out the window, I felt eyes on me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Matthew had just gotten into my head. But the unease wouldn't go away. Then, a few days later, the first sign of trouble appeared. It started small, a missed call from an unknown number. Then another and another. When I finally answered, there was nothing but silence on the other end. The calls came at all hours, disrupting my sleep and shattering my nerves. Then the emails started. Messages from fake accounts filled with cryptic threats and veiled accusations. You should have kept your mouth shut. You don't know who you're dealing with. Stay out of his way. I tried blocking the numbers and deleting the emails, but they kept coming. I felt trapped, suffocated by an invisible force I couldn't fight. And then, one night, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, my hands trembling. Nothing looked out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I checked every room, every closet, every corner, but I found nothing. Still, I couldn't sleep. That night, I sat on the couch with a kitchen knife in my hand, staring at the door and waiting for anything to happen. That night, as I sat clutching the knife on my couch, paranoia seeped into my veins like poison. Every sound, a creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of traffic felt amplified, like a warning. I kept replaying Matthew's words in my mind. Daniel doesn't let threats go unanswered. But what threat was I really? I wasn't some big player in his life. I was just a woman who got tangled in his web. Still, whoever had been in my apartment, if they'd been there at all, wasn't here for fun. And that terrified me. The next morning, I decided enough was enough. I couldn't keep sitting around waiting for the next anonymous message or mysterious noise. I needed to take back control, and that started with finding out the truth. I called Matthew. He picked up on the second ring. "Sarah, someone was in my apartment," I blurted, pacing the living room. The door was open when I got home last night. There was a pause, and when he spoke, his tone was calm but edged with concern. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Nothing was taken, but I can't do this anymore. The calls, the emails, the messages, they won't stop. I feel like I'm losing my mind." "You're not," Matthew said firmly. "This is how Daniel operates. He wants you scared, paranoid. It's easier to control people when they're afraid." "Well, it's working," I said bitterly. "I don't know what to do." There was another pause, and then he said, "Meet me. We'll figure this out together." We met later that afternoon in a quiet park on the edge of the city. Matthew was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench and watching the world go by like he didn't have a care in the world. When he saw me, he stood and gestured for me to sit beside him. "I did some digging," he said, cutting straight to the point. "About Daniel, about his wife, about you." "Me?" I asked, frowning. "Your relationship with him wasn't random," Matthew said, his expression grave. "He chose you. Specifically." I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "Daniel doesn't leave things to chance," Matthew explained. "You think he just happened to meet you, happened to fall for you? No, he targeted you, and I think I know why." I stared at him, my pulse quickening. "Why, your job," he said simply. My mind raced. I worked in finance, not exactly glamorous, but I managed accounts for some high-profile clients. "What does that have to do with anything?" Matthew said. "Daniel's been in debt for years. Gambling, failed investments, you name it. He saw you as a way out." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I remembered the little things, the questions he'd asked about my job, the way he'd casually brought up money in conversations. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it, but now it all made sense. "He was using me," I whispered. Matthew nodded. "And when you ended things, you became a liability. He's afraid you'll talk, that you'll expose him. That's why. He's trying to scare you. He wants to keep you quiet." The conversation left me shaken, but it also gave me clarity. Daniel wasn't just a liar. He was a predator, and I'd been one of his targets. But I wasn't going to let him win. That night, I went through every message, every email, every interaction I'd had with him. I wanted to find anything that could prove what he'd done. Not just to me, but to everyone he'd hurt. And then, buried in my old texts, I found it. A conversation from months ago when we'd first started dating. "Daniel, you know, I've always admired how smart you are, especially with money. It's be fun working with all those big shot clients. Me. It's not as glamorous as it sounds. Half the time, I'm just crunching numbers for people who don't even know my name. Daniel. Still, you're amazing at it. If I ever win the lottery, you'll be the first person I call to manage it. At the time, it had seemed innocent, even flattering. But now, I saw it for what it was. A calculated move. He'd been laying the groundwork from the beginning, grooming me for whatever scheme he had in mind. I forwarded the conversation to Matthew, along with a note. Is this enough? His reply came within minutes. It's a start. Meet me tomorrow. The next day, Matthew and I met again, this time at a coffee shop downtown. He looked more serious than I'd ever seen him, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a tense energy. I've been digging into Daniel's finances, he said, sliding a folder across the table. He's in deeper than I thought. Loans, credit cards, unpaid debts, sits a mess. And the worst part, he's been laundering money through shell companies. My stomach turned as I flipped through the folder, the evidence staring back at me like a bad dream. How do you know all this? I asked, looking up at him. I used to work with him, remember? Matthew said. I know how he operates. And now that I have access to his patterns, I've been tracking his movements. He's getting desperate. Sarah. That makes him dangerous. Then what do we do? I asked, my voice shaking. We expose him, Matthew said simply. But we have to be smart about it. If we go to the authorities without solid proof, he'll worm his way out of it. We need something concrete, something he can't deny. And how do we get that? Matthew leaned forward, his eyes locking with mine. We get close. We make him thinks he's still in control. And then we take him down from the inside. Asterisk, I hesitated for a long time before agreeing to Matthew's plan. The thought of seeing Daniel again, of pretending I wasn't repulsed by him, made my stomach churn. But the alternative, letting him get away with everything he'd done, was worse. The plan was simple, at least on paper. I'd reach out to Daniel, make him think I wanted to talk, to work things out. Matthew assured me that if I played my cards right, Daniel's arrogance would do the rest. He'll think he's won you back, Matthew had said. And that's when he'll slip. It sounded easy enough, but as I stood outside Daniel's office that afternoon, my hands shaking and my heart pounding, I wasn't so sure. I took a deep breath and dialed his number. Sarah. He answered on the first ring, his voice cautious. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I've been doing some thinking, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Can we meet? There was a pause, and then, of course. When? Now, I said. I'm outside your office. Daniel looked as polished as ever when he met me in the lobby, his tailored suit and confident smile giving no hint of the chaos he'd caused in my life. But when his eyes met mine, I saw something flicker beneath the surface uncertainty, maybe even fear. I'm glad you called, he said, leading me to a quiet corner. I've been wanting to explain. I raised an eyebrow. Explain what? That you lied to me for 6 months? That you have a wife? Or that you've been using me to cover your financial mess? He flinched, his confident facade cracking. It's not like that, he said quickly. I never meant to hurt you, Sarah. I swear. Things just got complicated. Complicated, I repeated, my tone dripping with sarcasm. Right. Because lying and manipulation are just so complicated. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I made mistakes. I know that. But I care about you. I still do. The audacity of his words made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. If you care about me, then prove it, I said. His eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? I mean, be honest with me? About everything? Over the next hour, Daniel spun a web of half-truths and excuses, blaming his behavior on everything. From his troubled childhood to his stressful work environment. It was almost impressive how easily the lies rolled off his tongue, how effortlessly he made himself the victim. But then, just as I was about to lose hope of getting anything useful out of him, he slipped. I never meant for you to find out about the accounts, he said, his voice low. I froze. What accounts? He realized his mistake immediately, his eyes widening. Nothing, he said quickly. Forget I said anything. But it was too late. I pressed him, feigning curiosity and understanding, and eventually he caved. He told Me about the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the debts he'd been hiding from his wife and his clients. He even hinted at the people he owed money to, dangerous people who wouldn't hesitate to ruin him if they found out he'd been skimming off the top. By the time we parted ways, I had everything I needed. That night, I met Matthew at a bar on the other side of town. He was already waiting for me, his expression unreadable as I slid into the booth across from him. "Well?" he asked. I handed him the notes I'd taken. He talked, more than I thought he would. Matthew scanned the notes, a slow smile spreading across his face. "This is good," he said. "Really good. If we can corroborate this with financial records, we've got him." "And then what?" I asked, leaning back in my seat. "Then we take it to the authorities," Matthew said. "But first, we need to make sure he can't cover his tracks. That means getting access to those accounts." I frowned. "How?" "He's not exactly going to hand over his passwords." Matthew's smile turned sly. "That's where you come in." My stomach dropped. "What? He trusts you now," Matthew said. "Or at least, he thinks he does. If you can get close enough to him, convince him you're on his side, he might let something slip. Or better yet, give you access outright." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "You want me to go back to him? Pretend like everything's fine? Like I don't know what he's done?" "It's risky, I know," Matthew said. "But it's the only way. If we wait too long, he'll cover his tracks, and we'll lose our chance." I wanted to argue, to tell him it was too dangerous, but deep down, I knew he was right. Daniel was too smart, too careful. If we didn't act now, we'd never get another shot. The next day, I called Daniel again. "I've been thinking," I said, forcing a smile into my voice, "about us." His tone immediately softened. And I think. "I want to give us another chance," I said. "But I need to know you're being honest with me. No more secrets." There was a pause, and then he said, "Of course. No more secrets." The irony of his words nearly made me laugh. But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't ignore the knot of dread forming in my stomach. I was walking straight into the lion's den. Pretending to trust Daniel again was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Every smile I gave him felt like a betrayal of myself. Every casual touch like an act of war. But I pushed through the nausea and forced myself to play the role of the forgiving, vulnerable girlfriend. He took the bait easily. Within days, we were back to our old routine, or so he thought. Dinner at his bachelor pad, flirtatious texts throughout the day, even promises of a fresh start. But this time, I wasn't the love-struck woman hanging on his every word. I was watching him, listening for every slip, every clue. And then, finally, I struck gold. It happened one evening over a bottle of wine. Daniel was in a good mood, his confidence fully restored. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass as he talked about his big plans for the future. "You know," he said, his voice smooth, "I've been thinking about getting out of the city. Starting fresh, somewhere new, somewhere quieter." I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "What about your business?" He waved a hand dismissively. "It'll take care of itself. I've set things up so I don't have to worry about it." "And what about your accounts?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "You said before you were moving things around to make them more secure." He froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then he smiled, leaning forward to refill my glass. "You don't miss a thing, do you?" "I'm just curious," I said, twirling the stem of my glass. "You're so smart with all of that. It's impressive." His ego swelled visibly, and he laughed. "Well, I've got a few tricks up my sleeve." "You have to?" "In my line of work, like what?" I pressed, my heart pounding. He hesitated, but the wine and his own arrogance got the better of him. He started talking about offshore accounts, about how he'd structured his shell companies to avoid detection. He didn't give specifics. He wasn't that careless, but he said enough to confirm what Matthew and I already suspected. The next morning, I met Matthew in a parking garage. The notes I'd taken clutched tightly in my hand. "He's planning to run," I said as I handed them over. "He thinks he's untouchable." Matthew flipped through the notes, his jaw tightening. This is good. We're close. We need one more thing: access to those accounts. I frowned. How? He's not going to just hand over his passwords. No. Matthew said, his expression unreadable. But he trusts you. If you can get his laptop or his phone, even for a few minutes, I can extract the information we need. My stomach twisted. You want me to steal from him? Not steal, Matthew said calmly. Borrow, just long enough for me to get what we need. I wanted to argue, to tell him it was too dangerous, but I knew there was no other way. Daniel was careful, paranoid, even. This was our only chance. The opportunity came 2 days later. Daniel left his phone on the coffee table while he stepped out to take a call. My hands shook as I grabbed it, quickly texting Matthew the code I'd memorized when Daniel unlocked it earlier. Seconds later, Matthew's reply came through. Got it? You're clear. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, my heart racing. When Daniel came back, he didn't notice a thing. That night, Matthew called me. We have everything we need, he said. I've already sent the information to the authorities. It's over, Sarah. He can't hurt anyone else. Relief washed over me, so overwhelming I almost cried. It was finally over, or so I thought. 3 days later, I got a call from an unknown number. Sarah, the voice said, cold and calm. We need to talk. My blood ran cold. Who is this? Let's just say I work with Daniel, the voice replied, and I know what you've been up to. Before I could respond, the line went dead. Panicked, I called Matthew. I just got a call, I said, my voice shaking. Someone knows what we did. There was a long pause, and then Matthew said, we need to meet. Now. When I arrived at the cafe, Matthew was already there, his expression tense. What's going on? I asked, sliding into the seat across. From him, he hesitated, and for the first time, saw something I hadn't noticed before: guilt. I didn't tell you everything, he said finally. What do you mean? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. I wasn't just trying to stop Daniel, he said. I was trying to save myself. What are you talking about? After Daniel ruined me, I got involved with the wrong people, Matthew admitted. I owed them money. A lot of money. When I found out about you and Daniel, I thought, if I could take him down, maybe I could fix everything. I stared at him, disbelief and anger bubbling inside me. So this wasn't about helping me. It was about saving yourself. It was both, Matthew said quickly. I swear. But now they know what we did, and they're not happy. The next few days were a blur. The authorities had enough evidence to take Daniel down, but the people he owed money to weren't satisfied. They wanted revenge, not just on Daniel, but on anyone who had crossed him. I started getting threats. Anonymous notes slipped under my door. Shadowy figures lingering outside my apartment. I felt like I was being watched, hunted. Matthew tried to reassure me, but it was clear he was just as scared as I was. We'll get through this, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The final blow came a week later. I came home to find my apartment ransacked. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied, pictures smashed. And on the wall, scrawled in red paint, were the words, "You should have stayed quiet." I packed my bags that night. I didn't tell Matthew where I was going. I didn't tell anyone. I just disappeared. As I drove out of the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that Daniel's web of lies and deceit would continue to haunt me. But for now, I was free, and that was enough. That's the end of today's story. Did things turn out the way you thought, or were there some surprises along the way? Share your thoughts in the comment side. Love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you haven't joined the community yet, now's the perfect time. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always the first to catch new stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next adventure.